the food pyramid that the USDA put out was quote unquote sold to the highest bidder.
Cheerios, chocolate covered almonds. I know M&M's was somewhere on this list
Yeah,
too.
they were pretty high up.
Healthier than beef, eggs, and cheese.
This is crazy.
Do the opposite of what the government tells you. If you flip that original food pyramid on its head, you would be very healthy. They blamed a food group that we have been eating for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, that it was bad. And that food group was... Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most important podcast episode we've recorded to date, and maybe the most important one we will ever record. And if there's one you listen to until the end, it is definitely this one.
We know that America is one of the most unhealthy, obese countries in the world. 42% of Americans are obese. Categorically obese. Not overweight, but obese.
And 38% of the American population is pre-diabetic.
11% of the American population is diabetic.
Going off of that, 48% of American adults suffer from some form of cardiovascular disease.
23.5 million Americans suffer from a form of autoimmune disease.
And 39.5% of Americans will be diagnosed with cancer at one point in their life. So why are we telling everyone this, Kevin?
Yeah. We like to focus on the root cause on this podcast. Those numbers are terrifying. Mm-hmm. They should be shocking to anyone hearing them.
And those numbers are only getting worse.
They're only going up. Today, we're going to focus on how we got here. How did we get to where we are today? And it's going to surprise you. It's going to blow your mind a little bit on what happened and how we got here.
Yeah, it blew our mind when we were researching all of this these past few weeks. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's get into it.
Our story today starts in the 1970s when the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, hired a woman, a nutritionist named Louise Light, to come up with a new nutritional guideline for Americans. Let's dive in.
So like Kevin said, in the 1970s, this woman, Louise Light, was hired to come up with nutritional guidelines for the United States. And she did a bunch of research, and she came to the conclusion that Americans should be consuming high-quality animal protein, fruits and vegetables, high-quality fats, specifically olive oil, and then also consuming, but limiting grain consumption. And if you are going to consume grains, focusing on whole grains instead of refined grains.
Okay. So immediate take there. What does that tell you? How is that?
I think that's great.
Okay.
These are great suggestions that if Americans followed these suggestions, I think we would be very healthy.
Fantastic.
And we wouldn't have all those problems that we just mentioned.
Yes. So that's what happened. That's what the USDA came out with, right?
Wrong. So Louise Light, she took these recommendations to the U.S. government, and they basically changed it completely. And this is when the government came out with the nutritional guidelines for Americans in 1980. And what were those guidelines? A lot of people know them as the food pyramid. And it recommended 6 to 11 servings of grains, so bread, cereal, rice, and pasta. And there was no distinction between whole grains and refined grains. It said 3 to 5 servings of vegetables, 2 to 4 servings of fruit, 2 to 3 servings of milk, yogurt, and cheese, 2 to 3 servings of meat, chicken, fish, and eggs. So if you look at this pyramid, you'll know at the bottom it's grains, and then we have vegetables and fruit, and then towards the top of this pyramid, we have things like dairy and animal protein. With this, they also recommended to use fats, oils, and sweets sparingly, and also to reduce our fat intake to 30% of total calories, and reduce dietary cholesterol, and reduce salt intake. Okay, so I know that's a lot.
Yes.
But that's what they suggested.
Yes. And we've talked about a lot of those different areas before, but there's two that absolutely stand out on this food pyramid. The first is the 6 to 11 servings of bread, cereal, rice, and pasta. That's a whole box of cereal.
Yep.
To consume every day.
Or 11 slices of bread.
Yes. Who is having 11 slices of bread?
Hopefully no one.
Yeah. And the other one that stands out is 2 to 3 servings of meat, fish, chicken, eggs. What would you say is the right amount? What are you consuming personally?
Oh, I consume a lot of protein. It's recommended nowadays that we should be consuming 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. So I'm about 170 pounds. I should be consuming 170 grams of protein per day, ideally.
Yeah.
These recommendations are nowhere close to that.
Right.
And I mean, protein is so incredibly important, but one of the main things is that it helps us build muscle, and muscle is very important for longevity and being healthy and preventing a lot of those diseases that we talked about.
Yeah. So what happened? What happened between Louise Light's food pyramid and the one the USDA put out? There's a famous quote that she has specifically, and she says that the food pyramid that the USDA put out was quote unquote sold to the highest bidder. It wasn't a matter of what was best for Americans. It was a matter of which industry had the most money to offer.
So to really fully understand this, we have to rewind to 1972.
Okay.
There's going to be a little bit of history here, but stay with us. So in 1972, the grain industry became deregulated. So there used to be a limit on the amount of grains that farmers could produce. But in 1972, this was eliminated. Farmers could grow as much grains as they wanted to. And when I say grains, the main 3 crops that I'm referring to are wheat, corn, and soy. And the reason this happened was because a man named of Earl Butz, who was Secretary of Agriculture at the time, he wanted to stay in office. He wanted to stay in power. And the main way that he decided he was going to do this was by getting the votes of the farmers. And he did this by deregulating the grain industry and allowing farmers to grow as much grain as they want to ultimately have them make more money and make them happy and vote for him to stay in office. Another piece to this was that a lot of these grains that these farmers were producing, they were selling it to other countries because many other countries, or some of them, were poor planning and different things. They had too many people and not enough food. So a lot of people were starving. So us in the United States, we had so many of these grains, so we were selling it to a lot of other countries. But it got to the point where we had excess grains. We had more grains than we needed. We had more grains than we were able to sell. And Americans found, or the United States, we found that we had extra grain, specifically wheat, corn, and soy, and we didn't know what to do with it.
Okay.
So that kind of sets us up
Yeah.
for getting into the meat of this now.
Yes. So just to recap, we've got excess grains that we need to figure out what we're going to do with. But really the new legislation from Earl Butz, it took all these tiny little farmers that were capped at how much they could produce and effectively forced them to combine, create giant conglomerates of farmers that could produce so much more now and no cap on how much they could produce. There's no limit now. So that leads us to where we are now.
Yes.
So let's go from there. What does America decide to do with all this excess grain that we have?
So America wanted to convince people, the American people, that basically we should be consuming more grains. And how do we convince America that we need to be consuming more grains? Well, at this time, there was also a rise in heart disease and cancer. It was becoming more prevalent than it used to be. This was still in the 1970s. And we needed a way to basically convince people that we should be consuming more grains. But with that, we needed to convince people that a certain food was causing this. And they ignored that there was more pollution than ever before, and all these factories are releasing toxic pollutants into the air, and that there was the rise of processed food. But they ignored all that. And what did they blame instead? They blamed a food group that we have been eating for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, that it was bad. And that food group was meat. And this was when the government came out and said saturated fat is bad, cholesterol is bad, it's causing heart disease.
Yeah. They found their villain.
Yeah.
And their villain in this story is meat. And they took all of the bad that was happening and blamed it on meat. But there were 2 studies that they used to do that.
Yeah.
What were those?
Yeah. So they specifically referenced 2 studies. One of them, and I think we've talked about both of these previously on the podcast, but one of them was the Ansel Keys. It was an Ansel Keys study that he had done in 1963, where it was called the 7 Countries Studies. So Ansel Keys cherry-picked data and basically found these certain populations in the world where there was higher meat consumption and higher risk of heart disease. But he didn't take into account anything else. And anything that didn't align with basically the conclusions that he wanted, he just threw away. Another study that they pointed to was the Harvard study, where Harvard scientists were paid off by the sugar industry to basically conclude that fat was the culprit of heart disease, instead of, when in reality it was sugar. They found that sugar was the culprit, but they blamed fat instead. So these were the 2 main studies that the government pointed to convince Americans that meat, and specifically the saturated fat and cholesterol in meat and eggs, is what's causing this rise in heart disease, and convinced us to consume more grains because grains lower your cholesterol.
So we've got our villain, we've got the meat,
Yeah.
we've got the studies to back it up. We've got 2 of them, both of which are rigged in various ways. One with poor data, and then another with who was actually doing the study.
Literally paid off. And there was no, I guess, Big Sugar helped fund the study, but that wasn't disclosed anywhere until years later it was found out that they were a big part of it.
Yep. So perfect. We've got everything we need here, but we need to solidify this so that Americans will actually believe it and consume it. We need to put together something that makes it easy to digest. And what do we come up with?
The food pyramid.
The food pyramid.
And it's those things that we talked about earlier. It's focusing on 6 to 11 servings of grains per day, and basically limiting our fat intake. And they even told us other things like, for example, reducing butter intake and consuming things like margarine instead, which is hydrogenated vegetable oils. You still see this today, like Crisco. That's hydrogenated vegetable oils, which contain trans fat, which are the worst type of fat for us. And then they told us to limit intake of fatty meats and to eat lean meats instead. Avoid red meat, because that's the worst. That's the highest in saturated fat. That's the highest in cholesterol. So consume things like chicken and fish, which we know they're not bad, but to avoid the fatty meat. And then limit eggs, because eggs are high in cholesterol.
Yeah. There was about a 10% obesity rate in the US in the 1970s. It's amazing. If you look at a chart, 1980, it just starts to spike. Up to now, we're at 42%. It's 4x'd since the food pyramid was introduced.
In 1980.
In 1980.
And that's what, 43 years later?
Yeah.
It's times 4?
Yes.
It's 4x'd? That's not a long period of time.
No.
And even if you look at pictures of Americans, I've seen pictures of Americans on the beach, or, I've seen clips of people walking through the streets of New York City in the 1960s, in the 1970s. Mostly everyone was thin.
Yeah.
It was hard to pick out someone that was overweight. And now, go to a beach.
Yeah.
Go to New
Go
York
to a mall.
City.
Go to a grocery store.
When we would always go to Disney.
Yeah.
Growing up,
Yep.
we would go with our dad every year to go see spring training baseball, and we'd go to the parks and everything. I was always shocked at how many people were overweight, like extremely overweight.
Yes.
And I was like, whoa. But I guess that was like kind of normal.
Yeah, it is.
For us, at least.
It is normal. You go from being in a room where 1 in 10 people is obese to 4 in 10 people. Every room you go into, it's so much more.
Yeah.
So that's exactly the effect that this food pyramid, the guidelines for America, had in 1980.
Right. So now all these people are eating grains and limiting our fat intake. Grains are specifically, refined grains. That they're telling us to eat cereal for breakfast, starting our day with a big bowl of carbs and sugar with little to no nutrients. The only nutrients that was in cereal was the artificial synthetic vitamins and minerals that they're putting in there that our body really doesn't know what to do with. It's not well absorbed at all. We're going to have a huge blood sugar spike first thing in the morning, and we're going to be so hungry throughout the day. It's going to cause us to overeat, but we're not going to be consuming fat or these other foods. We're going to be consuming more grains because that's what America is telling us. That's what the government is telling us to consume. So this was a huge problem. Yeah. People are, like we said, they were getting fat. They were, if anything, we're getting more heart disease, more cancer. Autoimmune diseases started to rise. It just blows my mind that the food that we were eating for hundreds of thousands of years, meat and eggs, was overnight vilified, and it was based on inaccurate science.
Yeah, you could tell how passionate you are about this. It's getting you fired up.
It is.
Just doing the research, it was getting you fired up.
Yeah.
And now it's coming through here. And it's crazy to see this. And this isn't a case of, hey, we didn't have good information back then. We made a couple mistakes. That happens. That's okay to make a mistake, to learn more information and fix it. That's not what happened here. They knowingly changed the data in order to put together something that appeased wherever the money was. There was some research we were doing, and the answer was as simple as, if you don't know how we got here, just follow the money.
Always.
Yeah.
Yep. These big food corporations. Yeah. They've taken over.
They have. And so that happened in 1980. We've learned a lot more information since then, and we've come out with additional guidelines since the 1980s. The next one, let's fast forward.
Yes.
Now to 2011, and we had our next big revelation in how Americans should consume food, and that is what came out as called MyPlate.
Yep.
What was MyPlate?
MyPlate. So this was in 2011. They basically revised the food pyramid, and they specifically did this to help parents, educate parents on the best way to feed their kids. It's a good visual. So they have grains and vegetables as a bigger, and we'll flash a picture on the screen if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening, I guess, I don't know what.
Yeah, it's a plate.
What percentage? Yeah.
And they divide it up into 4 quadrants.
Right. And the two biggest are the grains and vegetables.
Yeah.
Are the two biggest.
They're more than a quarter.
More than a quarter
of the plate.
Yeah. And then the other part is fruit and protein.
Yep.
And those are smaller.
Those are definitely smaller. Yes.
Smaller portions.
Yep.
So basically it's dividing it into those 4 groups. And it's good. It's a good visual. And they got some things good with this, but they also got some things where I think they're still missing the mark here. And I'm not exactly sure why they're still saying these things. But what did they get good?
What did they get right?
What did they get right from this? They're saying to prioritize more whole grains instead of refined grains, which is not something they said previously. So I like that. They're saying consume more vegetables. Before, it was the food pyramid, as many of you probably know, grains made up most of it, and then it was fruits and vegetables. But now they're saying, oh no, should be consuming the same amount of vegetables as grains, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
And then maybe even I guess they're recommending a little bit more protein and fruit than they used to.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things they're doing right with this MyPlate. What are they not doing well? What do they still need to fix? They're still saying, which I'm not sure why, because the guidelines themselves say that we don't need to be limiting fat. But for some reason, they're still saying that when we consume meat and chicken, we should be trying to consume the lowest fat meat and chicken that we can get, the leanest chicken, the leanest meat. They say if you consume ground beef, you should be consuming 93% lean, 7% fat ground beef.
And what do you consume normally?
80-20.
80-20, okay.
20% fat. I try to get as much fat as possible. We've talked about it previously. Fat is satiating. We need fat. Fat does not make you fat.
Fat does not make you fat.
Fat does not make you fat. Refined carbs and sugar make you fat. What the original food pyramid that came out, refined carbs, that's what was making people fat. That was what was making people obese. Yeah. You can't argue with the numbers.
No.
Also, just the prevalence of all processed food, ultra processed food, I should say. So they're still saying low fat, which I'm not sure why. They are instead of recommending. So a lot of people are vegetarians. Instead of telling vegetarians to get their protein from eggs. They're saying to get it from things like beans and peas and nuts and seeds, which, they're not necessarily bad, but if you're a vegetarian, I think you should really be consuming as many eggs as you possibly can. One, because of the protein, but also just the vitamins and minerals in eggs. We've talked about this before, but eggs are nature's multivitamin. They have so many different vitamins and minerals. And they're still saying to consume, if we do consume dairy, they're saying low-fat dairy, don't go for whole milk, go for skim milk, and minimize butter and fats. So, yeah, they're still getting a lot wrong.
They are. And this is only 12 years ago that this one came out. So a lot more recently. And it seems like they're still referencing that Harvard study with the fat correlation to heart disease here.
Yeah. And when you look deeper into this, there is no real evidence that higher intake of saturated fat causes heart disease.
Yeah.
If anything, it's the opposite.
Yeah.
It's higher saturated fat intake, you're less likely to develop these things. It's crazy.
Yeah. So this MyPlate study, this new set of guidelines came out in 2011, and that was when President Obama was in office, and the First Lady, Michelle Obama, at the time was very into nutrition and fixing our obesity problem in America. It was a big part of her what she was kind of involved with in the campaign.
Yeah. She saw all these things that we saw, the obesity and diseases skyrocketing, and she's like, okay, we got to do something about this.
Yes. So she comes out with MyPlate in 2011. What happens after that, though?
Well, I remember watching some videos about this. She was very keen on telling people to focus on their nutrition and what they're eating. But all of a sudden, you could see there was this flip. It went from let's eat better and let's move to let's move. And she completely stopped talking about nutrition. Why this happened? I assume there was some pushback from maybe these big food corporations, and they're telling the government, hey, we can't have her saying to avoid all of these processed grains and ultra-processed food because then we'll make less money.
Yeah, a little bit of speculation here, but it's just like, what does your gut tell you? If you're looking at this and all of a sudden, after years and years of pushing refined grains, then they say, actually, have whole grains.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden they're like, actually, we didn't say anything.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
yeah,
it just makes you think.
Exactly. And when we keep saying refined grains, like, look at any food in the grocery store. The first ingredient is refined wheat flour. It'll just say wheat flour. I mean, basically 3 ingredients is what makes up most processed food at the store. It's refined grains, it's added sugar, added cane sugar or high fructose corn syrup, and then it's the vegetable oils, which also, that was another point in this when the food pyramid came out, or the initial food pyramid came out in the 1980s. They were also saying to avoid butter, avoid beef fat, avoid, I guess those are the 2 main things. But then they said, replace those fats, replace the foods that are high in saturated fat with these vegetable oils. Canola, sunflower, safflower, soybean, corn oil, all these highly processed, terrible for you oils, because these lower your cholesterol, and cholesterol is the devil. We need to lower the cholesterol. So that was another piece of this.
Yeah.
I forget what I was saying. Where was I?
It's just, you can't trust a lot of what comes out of some of these organizations. And we'll finish there in a little bit with that. But it makes it hard to believe.
Yeah. Oh, I was saying, the 3 ingredients in most processed food. It's those 3 ingredients. Refined grains, added sugar, and vegetable oils. Look at the ingredients on a Ritz cracker. Those 3 ingredients. Look at the ingredients on a Pop-Tart. Same ingredients. Cereal, same ingredients. Like, this is the definition of ultra-processed food. It's taking food and it's turning it into something that doesn't even remotely look close to food anymore. And then they add, all these flavorings and artificial colors and artificial sweeteners and all these terrible for you ingredients. So that's when we say refined grains, that's what we're referring to. And they told us that we need to be consuming more of this.
Yep. So this came out, the MyPlate was 2011. We're going to fast forward again. It turns out America really likes to put out nutritional guidelines.
Yeah.
So was it last year, they the NHI, the National Health Institute, gave a bunch of money to Tufts University to perform a comprehensive nutritional study and effectively come out with another version of the food pyramid. And they came up with something called the Food Compass Score.
Yeah.
What was that?
Well, this took them 3 years to come up with. And like you said, this was the, and I quote, most comprehensive and science-based nutrient profiling system to date. That's what they said.
Promising, right?
Yes. But when I first saw this last year, I honestly thought it was a joke. I was like, this cannot be real. Some random person made this to trick us and April Fools.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it was not a joke. So the results of this study basically ranked foods, and I'm sure many people are familiar with this. We'll flash it on the screen for those watching. For those listening, they basically have, it's a chart, and it goes from green, yellow, and red, ranking foods based on nutrient density, I guess, from best to worst. And the results of this study said that the 3 worst foods that you can eat, and remind you, this came out last year, are cheese, eggs, and beef. Those are the worst foods you can eat.
The worst things.
So what are the better foods you can eat? Well, things like Cheerios, chocolate-covered almonds, and even Lucky Charms. I'm going to repeat that. Cheerios, chocolate-covered almonds. I know M&M's was somewhere on this list,
Yeah,
too.
they were pretty high up.
Healthier than beef, eggs, and cheese. And Lucky Charms were all ranked higher.
This is crazy. It feels insane.
Yeah. I think when this came out, I think a lot of Americans, I think it opened a lot of Americans' eyes.
Yeah.
And be like, okay, something's wrong here.
Yeah.
I'm no nutrition expert, but I know for a fact that beef and eggs are more nutritious than Cheerios, Lucky Charms. I think Mini Wheats was also on the list, M&M's, and chocolate-covered almonds.
Yep.
Are you kidding me?
I really don't know. I don't know who looked at this and said, yep, that's going to work. That's going to be really good.
Yeah. And this chart went viral. Like I saw so many people making videos about this saying, I cannot believe what a complete joke this is. And it seems like, we still got it wrong. Years later, first pyramid came out in 1980. Here we are in 2020. This came out in 2022. We're still just as clueless, and I think we're still confusing Americans.
Yeah, it is. It's horrible to be confusing people like this, where you're recommending things that have known issues. Every piece of data, every statistic that we talked about at the beginning continues to rise. And the way that we approach food is, it might be worse than it was 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Looking at this food compass versus the original food pyramid.
Yeah. And another thing to note is that these big food corporations, which we know, they own, you go to a grocery store, it's these big food corporations, they own so many other brands, even though you may not know you're buying, and I guess we've talked about this previously with all these big food corporations buying the smaller brands, which I know people get very upset about, which I understand because these big food corporations, they own everything. But these big food corporations, they spend more than $11 billion a year funding nutrition studies, influencing public policies, like probably this tough study, and convincing doctors that basically that we should be consuming more ultra-processed food and limiting the amount specifically of meat, eggs, butter, and full-fat dairy that we should be consuming.
Yeah.
And I think it's completely wrong, and we should be doing the opposite.
Yeah. You're fired up about this for obvious reasons. And it sounds in your voice, too, like you're a little frustrated and sad.
I'm just saying, nothing's changed.
Yeah.
Like 1980 to 2022, nothing's changed. We're still recommending the wrong foods, and we're still demonizing the healthy foods that we were eating for hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah. Something else that came to my mind that I was thinking about here is that does the grain industry, does the farmers and big food companies, do they have that much power where they're able to influence this so much? And I think that is only one side of this coin. And if you flip over to the other side, what you'll see is that all of these processed foods, refined grains, make people
refined sugar,
refined sugar, make people really sick. And then the natural question is who benefits from people being sick? And then you look at the pharmaceutical industry and people with these chronic diseases, as sad as this is, are recurring revenue. Every 8 weeks, Kevin, go to an infusion center and I get a drug pumped into my body because it helps me basically be alive and feel better. I don't want that, but that's what I have to do. I am a recurring revenue line item to a big pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah. Multi-billion dollar. It's not like, we'll make a few dollars off Americans. No, it's multi-billion dollar industry from sick Americans. And it's just a reoccurring loop. It's eat the processed food, go to the doctor, get drugs.
Yes.
And all these, for you, yes, it seems like it's helping you greatly.
Yeah.
And making you feel fantastic. But for a lot of people, unfortunately, these drugs don't work.
Yeah.
And it's just like putting a Band-Aid on a symptom. Oh, you have this symptom? Let me just put a Band-Aid on that. But for most people, it's going to cause all these other side effects and cause all of these other problems. That's a great point to bring up.
Yeah, it's both sides there. It's not just the food industry. It's who benefits from Americans being sick.
And the fact that, I experienced this, you experienced this, many people I've talked to experience this, that when you do bring up diet to your doctors, they don't say anything.
No.
They don't say nutrition impacts, one, Crohn's disease, gut health, but also, anything, even like something like cancer. So, yeah, but they're not taught that. And that's something that I think it needs to change. Conventional doctors are not taught nutrition in school. I think it's like maybe 2 to 3 hours of nutrition that they're taught all through 8 years of, because they go 4 years of school and then 4 years of residency. Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think that sounds right. Yeah. 2 in school and then 2 on the job.
Yeah. So something needs to change.
Something does.
And I don't know if it is.
Yeah.
Anytime soon in our lifetime. No. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. Share the podcast.
Time will tell. Share the podcast. Yeah.
So what can people take away from this? We've gone through and we understand now why we're here, how we got here. What's the takeaway for people?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. The takeaway is do the opposite of what the government tells you. If you flip that original food pyramid on its head, you would be very healthy. If you flip this new tough study on its head, you would be very healthy. If you're consuming mostly eggs, full fat, preferably raw dairy and beef, I guarantee you'd be very healthy. You would not be obese. You would be at a lower risk for all of those diseases that we mentioned earlier. And you would just be so much healthier. So basically do the opposite of what the government tells you, but also do your own research. Don't just listen. Don't even us. Don't just listen to us and do what we tell you. Go do your own research. Listen to other people and do what you think is best for you and your family and your kids, or your parents, your grandparents, whatever it is. Do your own research. But one of the main takeaways, I think, is don't be scared of fat and cholesterol. I've said it 20 times already in the past 30 minutes, but I'll say it again. We have been eating meat for hundreds of thousands of years. The reason we are here today is because we made tools and we killed animals and we ate meat. So I think everyone should. I'm sorry for the vegans and the vegetarians out there. I know it's possible to be healthy if you don't eat meat, but for a majority of people, I think you should be consuming meat and you shouldn't be scared of saturated fat and cholesterol. Look at the data. Americans are only getting sicker and sicker. We need to stop, and I think a lot of people are waking up to this. Thankfully, with this the age of social media, I think more and more people are able to get their information and their opinions out there, and we're following mainstream media and what the government tells us to do less and less, which I think is a good thing. But unfortunately, the government is still telling us incorrect things, and Americans are still to this day only getting sicker and sicker. But I feel like I want to think that this is changing. And more people are opening their eyes to this, of how corrupt everything is and how the system, it's set up for us to fail. And we need to do our own research, make our own decisions, and ultimately be healthy.
Yeah. We've never had more information than we do today.
Mm-hmm.
And people are able to do their own research and get that information. People are also able to experiment with what works for them. We've talked about it so many times.
That's also true, yes.
Try something out, see if it works for you. And if it does, great. If it doesn't, then you can do something else.
Mm-hmm.
If you're feeling down and you're feeling a little bit overweight and you've been consuming mini wheats and goldfish and M&Ms, maybe it's time for a change.
Yeah.
Maybe it's time for something different. Just because the government said this is what you should be consuming doesn't mean you have to be consuming that.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And a note off that, don't feel like you have to make all these changes at once.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people that do try that, if you're on an ultra processed food diet and a lot of the food you're eating is not real whole foods, then make changes slowly, because that's going to be more sustainable over time. If you try to make all the changes at once, you're probably going to resort back to the previous diet that you were on.
Yep.
So don't feel like you have to change everything at once. Make small changes and experiment.
Yeah. I think that's all we got for you today.
That's all we got for you today.
Thanks for hanging with us. That was a lot.
Sorry if I got a little angry there, but please let me know. Leave us a review and let us know if you enjoyed this episode, because I mean, this is I make videos on a daily basis on Instagram and YouTube and all of this, and we started this podcast recently to really help people make healthier choices and ultimately be healthier. But I think this should hopefully explain a lot of why America is so sick, and it's really getting to the root cause of why we're so sick, and it's the reason it's the reason why I do what I do and why we are doing this podcast.
Yeah.
So
information is power.
Information is power. That is going to be it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you found this helpful, please share it with a friend and spread the good news.
Yes.
So that's going to be it. We'll see you next week in episode 18.
Bye.